Claudia Card suggests that social death is what separates mass murder from genocide. Beyond destructive physical violence, it is the destruction of community vitality. The worth of individuals' lives is minimized before they are killed, and with these murders comes irreversible damage to the web of relationships that define and enable prosperous communities. The Texas Rangers were responsible for social death along the U.S.-Mexican border, meaning, rather than being mass murderers, the Texas Rangers were responsible for genocide. Nevertheless, the Rangers are often portrayed heroically, which minimizes the atrocities within the borderlands and obscures their role in the formation of our nation's dehumanizing border policies. There is no question that the Texas Rangers were guilty of mass murder. Indigenous groups such as the Comanche were portrayed as savage threats to civilization. These portrayals allowed for violence to be used as a tool to expand Anglo control and displace native inhabitants, often with violence nearly causing extinction. Similarly, in the case of Mexican and Mexican Americans, the Rangers acted as a tool for white landowners to expand their control in newly profitable farmlands. Mexican Americans who refused to submit to theft of their lands were subsequently labeled as outlaws, meaning they were subject to the Rangers' violence. The Rangers killed innocent natives and Mexicans en masse, justified with revenge by proxy. This meant any ethnic Mexican or native was responsible for any violence against whites from within their communities. There was no space for the individual. Instead, the entire community was guilty. Socially, the Texas Rangers enforced an exclusive notion of U.S. citizenship that was limited to white Americans. This meant that white American communities were protected as legitimate, while violence eroded the social vitality of other communities. The actions of the Rangers went beyond mass murder to genocide, as the social death resulting from violence and thefts of land was central to the whitening of Texas. In an 1848 article, The Liberator describes a group of Rangers threatening entire towns with total destruction if they did not pay large sums of money. The lives of Mexicans and natives were reduced to less value than the lands they occupied and the money they possessed. This is a classic example of the devaluing of human life, which is a key facet of social death. John E. Dean describes the attitudes of expansionist Texans who felt they were a superior race and inferior races were doomed to subordinate status or extinction. White Texans intended to increase their control at the expense of other races, even if it meant complete annihilation. This statement fits with instances of genocide that we see throughout history. The Texas Rangers used techniques described by Bob Alexander as terrorism to scare natives and Mexicans into submission. The Rangers' violence was successful in destroying social vitality. This is supported by stats from Juan Gonzalez. Gonzalez shows that in 1850, the Tejano share of wealth and population was nearly identical. However, by 1870, Tejanos were 47.6% of the workforce, but possessed only 10.6% of the wealth. In an agricultural-based economy, land holdings are essential to the vitality of a community. By stripping other races of their land through violence, the Texas Rangers were instrumental in destroying the vitality of non-white communities and condemning them to a role of subservience within agricultural labor. Overall, it is clear that the Rangers went beyond mass murder to genocide by causing social death and near extinction in the case of the native tribes. We often assume the Rangers were a noble organization. After all, they have a baseball team named after them. Moreover, they were formative in our nation's border patrol and continue to be praised by politicians. This has been the dominant narrative throughout history, which has served to minimize the reality of white terror in the borderlands while demonizing Mexicans and natives as savages. While the Texas Rangers are often incorrectly portrayed as romantic heroes of the West, progressives were disgusted by their brutality. The abolitionist newspaper The Liberator correctly identified the Texas Rangers as barbaric thieves who terrorized Mexican towns. In an 1848 article, The Liberator exposed Rangers who extorted Mexican towns, threatening death if they were not paid enormous sums of money. The article states, "The Rangers will become a much more terrible scourge to the frontier than the dreaded Comanche or Sapara Indians." Clearly, this is not a politically correct statement. The author still held racist fears of Native Americans, which allowed genocide to ravage these communities. With this being said, the statement makes it clear to the reader exactly how violent the Rangers were. They were more horrible than a group that has, throughout our history, been vilified as an embodiment of savagery and violence. Despite the prevailing narrative that glorifies the Texas Rangers, it is clear that from their inception there were critiques of the organization based on their inhuman brutality. Why does this distinction matter? The Texas Rangers developed into the Border Patrol. Their legacies carried over genocidal policies that result in social death. However, now this violence has merely changed forms. For example, family separations today are clear examples of social death. Families detained due to illegal crossings often have their children taken from them and adopted by American families. This not only destroys families, but deprives children of their culture. The destruction of the family unit across a community is clear social death. Similarly, deportations into the interior of Mexico work to displace deported individuals from the web of relationships that is essential to survival when struggling. By deporting Mexicans to unfamiliar places, the Border Patrol effectively uprooted deportees' lives, making it hard for them to get back on their feet. These are both examples of social death. Fences that diverted migrants to more dangerous areas during crossing also resulted in enormous loss of life. Policymakers knew forcing crossings in dangerous areas would lead to incredible loss of life, but death from physical elements removed any direct blame from the U.S. However, the U.S. is still responsible for these lives lost. By glorifying the Texas Rangers, We are praising the founders of a system of genocide along our border. It is essential that we recognize the Rangers for what they are. Rewriting history to glorify genocidal groups creates a permissive culture towards dehumanization. We must recognize the violent history of our Border Patrol and reform accordingly.